welcome our next speaker, Justin Hesse, a software engineer. Today he'll be presenting Dev 101, an introduction to technical development in Dynamics CE. Please stick around after Justin's session for a live Q&A.
Hello everyone and welcome to DynamicsCon. My name is Justin Hesse and I am going to be presenting a session today, Dev 101, an introduction to technical development in Dynamics CE. I am a software engineer for a Microsoft Gold partner where I've been developing and supporting Dynamics customizations for the past 2 years. If you would like to contact me with further questions after the session, you can reach me at justin.hesse@mcaconnect.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So the purpose of this session today is to help familiarize you with some of the most common types of technical customizations done in Dynamics model-driven apps, especially CE, as well as some of the tools needed in order to develop them. By the end of this session, you should have a better understanding of some of the pros and cons of each type of customization and be able to identify which customization is most appropriate for a given request. Before we go into the different types of customizations, though, there are a couple of key ideas that we need to introduce first. These are very important to understanding how different types of customizations work and will give you a better idea of how the Dynamics system as a whole functions. The ideas that we're going to cover are synchronous versus asynchronous processes and client-side versus server-side processes. So we will start off with synchronous versus asynchronous. All right, so the first concept to introduce is the idea of the synchronous process. A synchronous process is when code in the system executes the moment it is triggered. For example, you might create a synchronous workflow that triggers the moment you update a particular field on a form. This can be advantageous in certain instances where you need the process in question to execute before anything else in the system related to it does. One example where you might want a synchronous process is in validating data updates made to a record to ensure that there are no issues with the record. It should be noted, though, that synchronous processes can have a negative impact on system performance. This is because the system is designed to assign resources to processes in the most efficient manner possible, and when synchronous processes activate, they immediately demand the resources needed to accomplish themselves from the system, which prevents the system from assigning its resources in an efficient manner. If you have a large number of synchronous processes running around at the same time, this can cause a negative impact on your system's performance. As such, synchronous processes should only be used in cases where an asynchronous process would not be able to adequately accomplish the request. Asynchronous processes are, of course, the opposite of synchronous processes. They occur sometime after the activation of the process itself. Generally, asynchronous processes will have less of an impact on your system performance because the system is allowed to assign resources to them in an efficient manner. You should generally be using asynchronous processes whenever possible. Now we need to go over client-side versus server-side. Client-side processes are code that is run on the machine of the user. Because of this, client-side processes are able to execute and perform tasks without the user sending any requests to the server, such as saving a record. This makes them ideal for anything involving updates to the UI. The primary example of a client-side process covered in this presentation will be form scripts. Another example not covered are business rules. Server-side processes, like their name suggests, are code that run not on the user's machine, but on the server where the model-driven app is hosted. In order for a server-side process to occur, some sort of signal must be sent to the server first, such as when a record is created, updated, or deleted. And some examples of server-side processes are plugins, workflows, and cloud flows, all of which we'll be talking about. So now that we have these ideas out of the way, there are 4 major types of customizations that we are going to be going through. For each one, we're going to go through an overview of what is involved in creating the customization, some key points to be aware of, a basic idea of where you can go in the system to find these customizations, and some examples of common client requests that can be achieved using them. We will start off with form scripts. Form scripts are pieces of custom JavaScript code. They execute client-side which means that form scripts are able to respond to UI events triggered by the user, such as changing the tab, editing a field, or even opening a form. Within the system, form scripts are stored as web resources. And as such, they can be found by navigating to the solution editor and clicking on web resources right here. While this is where they are stored, they generally aren't going to actually be doing anything until they are added to the form. Form scripts are added to the form via the form editor using the form properties button as shown here. You can see all of the scripts attached to a form by looking in the form libraries subgrid. Form scripts are set to trigger whenever a particular UI event occurs on the form. Scripts are attached to these events via the form editor, where they can be enabled or disabled. Checking the form editor is an easy way to see exactly what scripts are attached to and enabled on a particular form, which can help both functional and technical folks determine exactly what kind of functionality is present on the back end of their form. So you can see here we have our form library. This is the list of all of the forms that are attached, or all of the scripts that are attached to this form. And right here we have a list of the scripts that are attached to the onload event of the form. There are a few different examples of events that you can attach your scripts to. When the form first loads, that is referred to as onload. When the form is saved, it's onSave, or if a field is updated on the form, that is referred to as onChange. So let's go over some of the pros of working with form scripts. They are a powerful tool to customize the visual presentation of CRM to the user. They are able to respond instantly to user input in order to show or hide fields, tabs, or other things on the form based on the current state of the form. They're also able to make API calls to other systems, including CRM, which means that you can use form scripts to query data, update data, do things like that based on user input. They can also be used to create custom functionality such as Kendo grids. So this grid right here is completely custom. It exists on the form, but it has its own functionality that exists separately from CRM. And this was built using form scripts. Another pro of form scripts is that they are generally easy to debug because they are client-side, which means you can use a tool that we will talk about in a bit called Devtools to actually see what the code is doing in real time. Finally, form scripts are easy to keep track of updates to if you are using some sort of source control like DevOps. Of course, despite how powerful they are, form scripts do have certain important drawbacks that you should consider when deciding whether or not to use them. They can be more complex to develop than some of the other customizations mentioned here, and they have a higher tendency to fail than some of the other customizations, and they tend to fail in ways that are very visible to the user. So you can see right here, probably most of you recognize this dialog box because you have seen this on more than one occasion in the system. This is the script error dialog, and it comes up anytime you have a form script on your form that fails for one reason or another. Also, because form scripts are client-side, it means that a user is required to interact with the form in order to cause the script to fire. This makes them unsuitable for background tasks such as mass data updates. Finally, form scripts are written in JavaScript, which, if you are a programmer, you likely know is one of the trickier languages to learn. It has a lot of different quirks to it that can make it sometimes frustrating to deal with, and is part of the reason why form scripts tend to fail quite often. So now that we've gone over the pros and cons of form scripts, let's go through Devtools. Devtools are custom tools for web devs created by major browsers such as Chrome, Edge, Firefox, etc. To access them, all you have to do is press F12 while you have a browser open. Devtools provide a large number of very useful features for technical and functional consultants. For example, you can use them to view responses to API calls made by your computer. You can set breakpoints within form script code and then watch as the code executes in real time. And you can use them to search for errors in the console that may not be visible on the form itself. So sometimes a form script will have an error, but the error won't actually show as a dialog box, but it might show within the console. So definitely, if you are wanting to improve your understanding and ability to debug issues within the system, whether you are a functional or a technical person, it is definitely recommended that you learn more about and have an idea of how to use Devtools. Visual Studio is another tool to go over. It is the most used tool for a Dynamics developer. It is what is known as an IDE, or an integrated development environment, which basically just means that it is a suite of tools that together are used to help facilitate writing code. It offers a huge range of functionality to assist with coding. You could spend several days going over all of the different types of things that Visual Studio can do, and it is the primary tool used when writing or modifying code for both form scripts and plugins, which we will talk about in just a minute. The second type of customization that we will cover today is the plugin. Plugins are pieces of code written in C#, and they execute as server-side processes with Dynamics. They can be triggered by certain system events, such as the creation, update, or delete of a record, or they can be triggered manually by the user through the use of actions and ribbon buttons. Plugins exist in the system in their compiled form known as assemblies. When a plugin is compiled, the code within it is translated into a different format that is more easily read by machines, and in this form, it is not readable by humans, so opening one of these plugin records is not going to give you any insight into how the plugin works. Within the solution editor, plugins are going to be stored in their compiled form as plugin assemblies. Sdk Message Processing steps are messages that plugins listen for in order to know when to execute. Any plugin that is intended to be triggered within the system needs to have at least one SDK step associated with it. Common events for SDK steps to be associated with are on create, delete, and update of a record, and SDK steps can also be associated with actions, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, which allow for more fine-tuned triggering of plugins. Actions, at least with regards to plugins, are custom events that can be created in the system and associated with an SDK step in order to trigger a plugin. They are a very, very powerful way to extend the use of your plugins because they can be called by other pieces of code in the system, which allows you to use complex series of conditions to decide exactly when you want your plugin to be called. Because of this, and the fact that they can also pass data to and from the plugins that they trigger, they are able to greatly increase the flexibility of your plugins. A common example of the use of an action is using a script and a ribbon button to call the action, which allows users to trigger a plugin directly simply by clicking on a button. So now let's go over a little bit of the pros and cons of plugins. For the pros, plugins are the most powerful tool available to developers for large-scale processing of data. There is really no limit to how complex your plugins can be, and I have seen plugins that are thousands of lines of code long. They are often used to build complex and fast integrations into other systems a company might use, such as ERP systems like SAP, document management systems like SharePoint, and HR systems like ADP, etc. Plugins are able to be configured to run synchronously or asynchronously, which makes them very flexible. And through the use of actions, plugins can be fine-tuned to trigger only under very specific scenarios, which gives the developer pretty much complete control not only over what the plugin is doing, but under which conditions it triggers in the first place. Plugins have another benefit in that they are by far the fastest server-side process available in terms of execution speed. And like form scripts, it can be easy to keep track of changes to them due to using source control such as DevOps. Of course, given all of these advantages, plugins do have some important drawbacks. They are generally the most complex type of customization to build. They require a strong understanding of programming fundamentals in order to develop, which means that your citizen developers are not going to be writing plugins anytime soon. They are also time consuming to build and maintain compared to some other types of customizations. And as Uncle Ben would say, with great power comes great responsibility. The fact that plugins are so powerful and fast means that it is easy to unintentionally cause harm to your system in the form of loss of data integrity or system performance if you don't put careful thought into what your plugin is doing and when it is being triggered. Because plugins only execute server-side, this makes them inappropriate for responding to UI events. If you want to hide a field on a form based on some sort of user input, you are not going to be using a plugin. Because plugins run silently in the background, users are often not aware of their existence. And because they run silently, they also often fail silently. This means that it can be easy for a problem in a plugin to persist for months before being noticed, which can result in a loss of data integrity that can affect potentially tens of thousands of records. Finally, plugins can develop infinite loops of triggering, potentially causing degradation in system performance as they consume system resources. This can happen if, for example, you have two different plugins and one activates on update of an opportunity and makes an update to an account associated with that opportunity, and the other plugin triggers on update of an account and makes an update to an opportunity associated with that account. You can get into a vicious infinite loop that can consume system resources. So now that we've talked about the pros and cons of plugins, let's talk about some important tools for developing plugins. One of the most important tools in any dynamic CE developer's arsenal when working with plugins is the plugin registration tool. This tool is never going to be far from your fingertips if you are working with plugins. This tool allows us to not only add or register new plugins that we have built to the system, but it also lets us define, activate, and deactivate SDK steps used to trigger our plugins. And last but certainly not least, the plugin registration tool allows us to debug our plugins through a process called profiling. So you can see here, this is a screen from the plugin registration tool. We have filtering attributes. These allow you to specify specific fields on your entity that you're triggering your plugin on to say, I want the plugin to trigger when this field is updated, but not these other fields. We have execution order right here, which can determine which order your plugins are running on. So if you have multiple plugins running on the same step, you can decide which ones fire in which order. And finally, the plugin registration tool allows us to decide whether our plugins are going to be running synchronously or asynchronously. Debugging plugins is a significantly more involved process than debugging form scripts of a similar size and complexity due to the fact that the code is running server-side. One of the primary ways for us to debug plugins because of this is by using the plugin profiler functionality within the plugin registration tool. By profiling an SDK step for a plugin while it is running, we are able to capture a recording of its execution, and then we can replay this recording in Visual Studio in order to understand at a granular level what the plugin is actually doing. So you can see right here, this is an SDK step that is associated with a plugin. We can click Start Profiling within the plugin registration tool, which will basically start recording anytime the plugin triggers. We can then play these recordings back in Visual Studio. Our third type of customization to look at is the workflow. Workflows are configurable automated processes that execute server-side and can be set to run synchronously or asynchronously. There is something to note about workflows, though. Microsoft is pushing us to use flow instead of workflows. Anytime you create a workflow, you're going to get this message right here that says we recommend using Microsoft Flow instead of background flows. And this is why we're not going to be spending as much time on these compared to other customizations. Generally, what you should be doing anytime you are considering building a workflow is you should try to produce your functionality in Flow first. And if that is not really working, then you can use workflows as a backup. Workflows do have some pros and cons associated with them. They have some of the same capabilities as plugins, such as being able to update records within the system, They are among the easiest and simplest of all customizations to build, and they can be configured to run synchronously and asynchronously. Finally, and probably one of the main differentiators between whether you build a workflow or a flow, is that on-demand processes intended for organization-wide use are easy to make available to all users if they are built as workflows. Workflows do have a couple of cons. Microsoft is moving away from their use. They haven't made any official announcements or set any dates yet, but it seems very likely that workflows will be deprecated at some point in the future. So that is definitely something that you should be keeping an eye out for. And workflows have minimal capacity to accomplish really complex tasks. So if you want to do something simple in the system, a workflow might be appropriate, but anytime your task involves more complex things that you're trying to accomplish, you're probably going to be wanting to look at a plugin or flow instead. All right, now let's move on to Power Automate Flow. This is the last type of customization, and it is one that most of you are likely quite familiar with now. Power Automate Flows are the new-ish kid on the block. They have been around for a few years, but they are newer than the other types of customizations. And over the years that they have been around, they have grown significantly in terms of what they are capable of doing. They are now one of the most important tools in a Dynamics developer's arsenal. Flows are configurable automation processes with thousands of different connectors and actions, not to be confused with plugin actions, that when combined together are able to accomplish some truly impressive automation. Flows execute server-side and by design are asynchronous only. You can find Power Automate Flows by going to https://make.powerapps.com or us.flow.microsoft.com and clicking on Flows. So flows consist of two parts, connectors and actions. Connectors are signals from various different systems, such as CDS, SharePoint, Yammer, etc., that a flow can be set to listen for. When the signal is sent, the flow will activate and start performing actions. Actions, again, not to be confused with plugin actions, are various different things that a flow can do, such as send emails or create and update records. Power Automate Flows have a number of important advantages going for them that have resulted in them finding increasing usefulness over the past few years, and they are quickly replacing other customization types like plugins for some use cases. For one, flows are much easier and faster to build than plugins of similar complexity. They are capable of accomplishing many of the same tasks as plugins, so if you need to update records or query data or things like that, then you can often use a flow much more easily than you can a plugin. Finally, flows simplify the process of integrating Dynamics with other systems that connectors exist for. This can result in significant reductions in the time to build an integration if you are using Flow to do it than if you are using a plugin to do it. Of course, flows do have downsides associated with them as well, which will prevent them from completely replacing plugins entirely for the foreseeable future. While simple flows are much faster and easier to build than plugins that would accomplish the same task, they have a lot of difficulty scaling up in terms of complexity. A single plugin can be composed of thousands of lines of code in a compact and relatively easy to read manner, while still containing very complex flows of logic. A Power Automate flow of this level of complexity would be very unwieldy to develop, maintain, or debug. Another major issue with flows is their speed of execution. If you wanted to update a data set of 1 million records with a plugin, it might take you at most a few hours to finish the update. A flow would be able to do the same update in days or potentially even weeks. So you have at least an order or two of magnitude difference between the speed of your plugins versus the speed of your flows. This means that if you perform a data update with a plugin and then realize that there was an issue with how some of the records were updated, it may only take a few hours to correct the issue. If you are using a flow, it is going to take you much longer to actually resolve the issue. Flows, unfortunately, are very poor when it comes to certain tasks that plugins and JavaScript are able to easily accomplish, such as string parsing or accessing individual elements or subsets of arrays. While things like string parsing are possible to an extent in Flow, it will likely take much longer to do than it would within a plugin or form script, and regular expressions, which are a powerful type of string parsing available to almost all programming languages, are almost completely unsupported in Flow without paying for third-party connectors. Flows, like plugins, are only able to execute server-side only, which means that they aren't going to be useful for customizing the UI for users. Unlike plugins, flows are by design only capable of asynchronous execution. Because of this, form scripts and synchronous plugins are going to be strongly preferable for any types of data validation you're wanting to do in your system. Another issue with flows is that there is a lack of good source control for them. They do have some ability to look at their history of updates, but it is not nearly as easy to understand what kinds of updates have been made to a flow over time as it is to do with a plugin or form script that you have been judiciously using source control for. Finally, on-demand flows can only be utilized by those who the flow has been shared with. This is calling back to a point that I made with workflows, and that if you have a flow that you want any user to be able to trigger on demand, you have to share it with each individual user that you want to have access to the flow, which means that the users are also going to have access to edit the flow. You might want a simple flow to just send an email to someone carrying some data from a record, but you definitely don't want all of your users to be able to edit that flow, even if you want all of them are able to do it. So in this kind of scenario, you would actually want to use a workflow over a flow. So with our remaining time, let's go over some of the other tools for developers. First tool up is XrmToolBox. This is likely the most well-known third-party tool for dynamic CRM. It is a free application that can be used to download hundreds of different types of plugins from numerous developers to accomplish various tasks within the system. There are so many useful plugins available in XrmToolBox that it is hard to overstate just how useful this program is. From the ribbon Workbench, which is used to create new custom ribbon buttons within the system, to Fetch XML Builder, which can aid you in creating complex queries, to the plugin Trace Viewer, which allows you to easily search through plugin trace logs in the system when debugging. There are all sorts of different plugins within XrmToolBox that pretty much anyone working in Dynamics is going to have a use for. If you are at all interested in working in the dynamic space, then you either already have this tool installed already, or you should be installing it immediately. Within the ribbon, or within XrmToolBox, there is one particular plugin that is especially important for devs, and that is the ribbon Workbench. It allows you to create new buttons and add them to ribbons on forms and elsewhere in the system. Virtually all custom button development within Dynamics CE involves using the ribbon Workbench, and it also allows you to attach custom code to your buttons in order to enable complex functionality beyond what a flow or workflow is capable of with the simple press of a button by the user. With enable rules, you can also keep tight control over who has access to the buttons and add additional requirements such as specific data being present in order for buttons to show. So you might only want a user to be able to use a particular button if some set of data exists or doesn't exist within a record. The next tool to go over is Xrm Toolkit. This is the only paid tool that you have to actually purchase a subscription for to use that will be covered in this session, but it is definitely one that I recommend any developer within Dynamics CRM get a hold of. It provides substantial benefits to productivity when working with code customizations in Visual Studio. The main advantage of this extension is that you don't have to actually leave Visual Studio when publishing code updates you have made to your dev environments. This provides a seamless experience of editing and deploying code that you're working on without having to go through the otherwise manual and tedious process of deploying code updates yourself while you are still working on the customization. So you can simply go in here and click publish on, for example, a plugin or form script that you are working on, and it will automatically send the updates that you've been working on to the system. It also has other types of functionality, like letting you to edit your plugins and plugin registration steps, and to compare the code that exists on your machine with the code that exists within CRM itself. Next, we have the CRM RESTBuilder. This is an important tool. It is a free open source tool developed by Jason Latimer, who is a well-known dev within the CRM world. And it allows you to quickly and easily write JavaScript API calls within the CRM system. All you have to do is input the type of call you want to make, the entity you're making it on, and a few other minor pieces of information, and the tool will write the entire API call for you. This can save you a substantial amount of time if you don't have much experience with writing these types of calls yourself. It provides support for XML HTTP requests, web API, and so. And the last tool that we will talk about today is Fiddler. Fiddler has free and paid versions available from www.telerik.com, and it is an excellent tool when trying to debug certain issues in CRM, especially when you think there might be problems like permissions of the user. The ease of use of the tool and the ability to save and send logs to others means that it is an easy way to help a user with an issue they are having when you are unable to reproduce the issue yourself. You can simply have the user install the free version, walk them through capturing a log of their web traffic as they reproduce the issue they're having, and then have them send over the trace of it to you for analysis. Fiddler has a lot of other really powerful functionality as well that we won't go into today. But if you are at all interested in becoming a better developer, even outside of Dynamics, then learning this tool will help you go a long way. And so basically what Fiddler does is it captures all of the web traffic that is coming to and from your computer. So these are all instances of web traffic on your computer, and you can look through this to see if certain things are not going correctly. So if you have 400 or 404 messages getting sent in here, that you know that there's some kind of problem. And so this helps you to more easily visualize what is going wrong in terms of web traffic. Okay, so that is it for all of the tools. Now I have a few real world scenarios to go through as more of an interactive exercise for those of you who are here with me today. So these are real world scenarios. They are either exactly the scenario that I have worked on, or they are very similar to scenarios that I have worked on. So I'm going to read through the request and then give you a moment to decide which type of customization you would use to accomplish this request. So for scenario number 1, when a new opportunity record is created in the system, automatically assign the opportunity to a user based on the estimated value of the opportunity and the business unit the opportunity belongs to, and then send an email to the user notifying them of the new opportunity. So I will let you guys think for just a moment about what kind of customization, workflows, flows, plugins, or form scripts you would use for this type of request. So for this particular request, I used a flow. Why a flow? While the request presented here could be accomplished using something like a plugin or a workflow as well, the relatively simple nature of the request makes flow the ideal type of customization for this automation. It will be able to accomplish every aspect of it. So we need something to happen when a record is created within D365. We happen to have an existing connector for flow for this type of event. The request involves a simple update to the record based on succinct criteria from other related records. So you don't have any kind of really complex calculations or decision-making or anything else going on here. And the request involves sending an email to an internal user, which Flow has well-supported actions for. So real-world scenario number 2. When a user populates a required lookup field to an account on a new opportunity record, check to see if the account has been approved to do business with, and if not, notify the user immediately that the account must be approved first before filling out the other fields. So I'll give you just a moment to kind of decide what type of customization you think would be most appropriate here. So for this scenario, what I ended up going with was a form script. Why a form script? The request involves the user taking a particular action on a form. So you have a UI event, right? The request requires the retrieval of data from a different entity within the system. So you're going to need some way to query data related to other records in the system. Form scripts are great for using API calls. And finally, the user needs to know immediately that there is an issue with the accounts that they are trying to add to this opportunity before they have the chance to put other data into their fields and potentially waste time doing something that they're going to have to undo anyways. So the fact that form scripts execute client side means that you can respond the instant the user actually updates the account lookup to that issue account. And our last real-world scenario, a new field has been added to the device custom entity in our system to capture when it fails. This field needs to be populated based on complex logic surrounding other records related to each device record, and we have over 500,000 records in our system that need to be updated. We also may want to make further updates in the future to this customization and want to maintain a history of changes to the customization. Finally, we need the updates to be completed within a week for reporting reasons. So I will let you guys think for just a moment about what you would use to accomplish this type of customization. And give yourself a pat on the back if you answered plugin. Why would we use a plugin here? Number 1, the request involves complex logic in order to calculate what the value of a field should be based on multiple related records. Plugins are great anytime the request at hand involves significant complexity. Number 2, the request involves large numbers of records. Plugins are very good at dealing with large data sets. Certainly, they are better than Flow for these kinds of size of data set. Number 3, the request requires the need to keep track of changes made to the customization. So they may want to make updates to how this field is calculated in the future, and they want a history of the updates that have been made. Source control, such as DevOps, means that this is easy to do for code solutions like a plugin and more difficult to do for other solutions like a Flow. Finally, the data update needs to happen in a timely manner. If you have a Flow that is trying to update these 500,000 records, then it is going to take literally days for the plugin to finish executing, or for the Flow to finish executing. Whereas with a plugin, it would take you a few hours at most. So if you end up having an issue with the updates that you've made, it'll be very quick to undo what you've made with a plugin and to redo it, whereas it would be much slower to do it with a Flow instead. And so with that, we have come to an end of my presentation. I would like to thank the people of DynamicsCon for letting me present to you guys today, and I am here live with you to answer any questions that you guys in the chat may have. If you want to contact me after this, you can reach me. Again, my email is justin.hesse@mcaconnect.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So all of you in the chat here who have sat through my presentation, thanks for being with me today, and let me know if you have any questions.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my session. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm here with Audrey as my moderator.
Hey, Justin. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Audrey?
Doing well. I can almost hear you down the hall. We might happen to be working from the same office today, you guys. So we're live in Houston for you. All right, so I was going through the questions. Justin, do you want me to get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we've got a couple shout outs. Thank you, Nick, for lending us your wonderful graphics from your website. We're definitely appreciative when we're able to Google something and find a visual representation of what we're trying to convey. So thank you for letting us borrow this.
Yes, thank you so much, Nick.
Absolutely, so shout out to Nick Hans. Also, the next question is from Marcelo. He was asking if we can work with Visual Studio Code as opposed to just Visual Studio. And
yes.
Christine was wondering the same thing.
Yes, so you can actually use Visual Studio Code instead of Visual Studio if you are wanting to do development, especially if you just want to write like a really quick form script or something, then Visual Studio Code will work. The reason that I really like Visual Studio, though, is to deal with Xrm Toolkit, which is the paid extension for Visual Studio that I mentioned in my session. So basically, using Visual Studio with Xrm Toolkit is going to mean that actually publishing changes that you make to your code is a lot faster and easier to do than if you are writing it in Visual Studio Code and then manually updating the file within CRM that way. So yes, you can use Visual Studio Code, but if you want to use Xrm Toolkit, then you're going to want to use Visual Studio.
It has some versioning control around that publishing too, right, Justin?
So I believe Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code both can be connected to Azure DevOps.
Okay.
So source control shouldn't really be an issue there, as far as I'm aware.
That's great. All right, and then we've got Rafael that was asking about how he'd like to get started with plugins, and if you had any helpful website or blogs on tips on how to get started. And we did get a couple recommendations in the chat, but how about you, Justin? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I don't have any specific links right now, but definitely plugin development is something that there's a lot of resources online for. I have found Google very helpful whenever I have been working on developing plugins for CRM. So I'm sure that the links that people have posted in the chat will help you a long way. And of course, if you have any kind of like general questions or stuff, then you can feel free to shoot me an email and I can take a quick look.
All right, wonderful. And then Allison Bryden was asking, if you share a flow with the user, can they edit it? Can you just not give them run-only permissions? So Karen did answer that you can add multiple owners to a flow as well as read-only users. So thank you, Karen. Justin, did you want to add anything to that one?
Yeah, so I haven't done, mostly if I am building a flow that I want just pretty much anyone who has access to a record to use, I will actually connect the flow to a workflow. And so basically I will have a workflow that will call an HTTP request that will actually trigger my flow. And then I don't have to worry about actually sharing the flow with the users.
Yeah, because the HTTPS is a trigger for flow, correct?
Correct.
Perfect. Yep, I've definitely seen that one as well. All right, next one. Marcelo is asking, are plugins usually reliable, or do we need good judgment on who develops them? Also, has there been cases of bad plugins like breaking or messing up with the data on the database? And he's talking about the plugins on the XrmToolBox. Any bad experiences, Justin?
I have not really had much bad experience with the XrmToolBox plugins. Generally, whenever you are looking at plugins, you can see how often they've been downloaded. So the more popular a plugin is, generally the more reliable it's going to be. And most of the plugins that I use in development are ones that are just like very popular and well known within the community, like Ribbon Workbench or Fetch XML Builder. So I haven't had any real issues with XrmToolBox plugins.
But just maybe keep an eye out for how many downloads a plugin has. So if it has a lot of downloads, then it's probably pretty safe.
Yeah, great tip. I would also add that whenever I use a plugin for the very first time, I try to read what it's supposed to do, and I try to familiarize myself with it before connecting it to my environment and really performing it on a lot of records. So I think it's always wise to have a subset of records you try anything on. So I would definitely apply that to the XrmToolBox toolbox as well.
Yes, absolutely. Anytime you are doing any kind of data update, whether you're doing it with Flow or plugins, or if you're using an XrmToolBox plugin, you always want to be using it on a subset of records to test with first, to make sure that, if you have some kind of mistake that you have made in developing this or doing the update, it's a small number of records and you can easily fix the mistake. You don't want to do it on the whole database before you've actually checked to make sure that it's actually doing what you expect it to do.
Yeah, and thank you, Michael Forth. We were absolutely assuming this was in a sandbox, but we can never assume. So yes, in a sandbox, of course. Totally agree with you. All right. So Allison was asking, is there any good reference online for CE-specific examples of JavaScripts that folks have written? And then Nick Hans answered that he has some sample on his blog. So, if you guys want to look up Nick Hans, it looks like his blog has plenty of information for the community to share. So thank you again, Nick, for another shout out to you. But Allison and others, if you wanted the sample code and JavaScript, you can go to Nick's website. What about you, Justin? Do you have recommendations of other places you can get sample JavaScript?
Yeah, so there is a Dynamics Communities forum that I regularly go to when I have kind of any questions on Dynamics. Sometimes I have a functional question, which will be answered on the forum. Sometimes I'll have programming questions, which they also have people there who write stuff for. There are a bunch of people who write some really great blogs on these topics. So I have found learning, if I have a question about something in Dynamics CE, Google has been very helpful to me. Dynamics Communities forums have been very helpful to me. We have a great community here that loves to share info with each other. And so usually if you just kind of figure out, just ask your question to Google, and then at the end of your question, put in Dynamics CE, and there's a pretty good chance that you're going to have a result somewhere on your page that has an answer to the question you're asking.
Absolutely. And just to add one more thing to that as well, if you're part of a local community, of user group community, that's also a good place to, kind of bounce ideas with others and, see the partners in your area, because sometimes it's always strength in numbers and knowing, who's down the street in your city that's also experiencing these similar hardships and joys of system admins or development or deploying. It's always nice to have a community that's physically close. So it's check out your local chapters as well. All right. Then Allison asked, what was the link for Jason Latimer's CRM RESTBuilder? And so Nick sent her the GitHub URL for all the releases that he has. I believe he also has a few Xrm Toolboxes tools as well. Jason Latimer does. Is that where you have yours, Justin, or do you have a standalone version?
No, I got CRM RESTBuilder from his GitHub page.
Okay, you did.
Yeah, he's
perfect.
He's a really great dev. He's made a lot of really useful things. Definitely check him out. Check out some of the stuff he's built. It's been very helpful for me as a dev.
Absolutely. Yeah, I got to meet him a couple years ago, and I couldn't believe I was in the same room. I was trying to compose myself. I'm hi. It's great when you meet people from the community that you've just seen their name everywhere. And yeah, it's great. So again, it's always great when people are contributing to the community like this. All right, so there was a lot of positive feedback, Justin, on the format of your last slides. Pertaining to the use cases and questions on scenarios. That was really well accepted here. There's a lot of nice comments in the chat how it got them thinking, And a lot of them, would have proposed a plugin or some sort of other automation when it was maybe only a script that was needed. So I think it's always a good learning experience and opportunity to know that, hey, a simple, less work extensive script might do the trick. So thank you for that. And then Nick was just sharing some things that he did on his leads to, for it to get assigned to the right person and then have an email sent and a task sent. So it's always fun to kind of have solutions shared with the community, because it's always nice to have recognition for our development efforts and our business analytics skills. So thanks, Nick, for sharing that solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me just scroll up in the chat here and see if there are other things that I missed, but feel free, Justin, to add anything else.
No, it's been great to have all of you here. I'm loving the questions. I love that there's a bunch of excitement for my session. This is my first time here at DynamicsCon, and I'm just overwhelmed by the response. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's see if there's any more questions. Justin, feel free to help me out here and like the bottom of the chat. Oh, here we go. I got one here from Bjorn Haug. Are webhooks and Azure functions or web jobs relevant? Do you see them becoming the default pro-code platform across Microsoft products, Dynamics included? If you work with SharePoint, I'm thinking about like the SharePoint add-ins as well. Do you want me to repeat that, or did you get this?
Let me try to scroll up to that question.
1040.
1040, okay.
Yeah. Timestamp on that guy. So while Justin's doing that, we've got his Liz Hallen that just did a shout out that you can see yesterday's sessions on Umbrella that were recorded. So that's perfect. Thank you, Liz. She says there's a filter for past content to view all sessions.
So Bjorn, to answer your question, I haven't had a lot of experience with Azure functions specifically, but webhooks are definitely going to be becoming more and more relevant. So one thing that I have found to be very useful within, especially like Power Automate flows, is using HTTP requests. So HTTP requests allow you to trigger your flow from some other kind of customization. So for example, I was talking about using a workflow to call an HTTP request that triggers a flow and then passes data to it. But you can also use that within a flow to perhaps send data to some other type, like a plugin. So maybe you have some kind of task that flow is not very good for, like you want to sort an array within your flow. Doing that within flow itself is very complex. It is time consuming to do, and it's not very intuitive. But what you could do instead is you could call an HTTP request within your flow to some kind of API that you're hosting somewhere and have code within that API sort your array for you and then pass it back to your flow at the end.
All right, thanks, Justin. There's just one more thing in the chat. It was just David Wade was doing a shout out here to the YouTube channel for Soft Chief Learn for plugins. And so the one video he sent in the chat was never do this, 5 mistakes while developing plugins in D365. So if anyone wants to check out that YouTube channel, you can take a look at the plugins folks make while running, the mistakes people make while writing plugins. And so I think that was the last thing in here. Oh, here we go. We got one more. So from Bjorn again, he said, I feel solidarity about regex. How do you authenticate the Microsoft Flow HTTP requests?
So for example, if you are calling the flow itself with an HTTP request, then the flow has its own link that is automatically generated. So, I mean, as long as you're not sharing that online or anything, I don't see anyone being able to actually like guess that link. And even if they can guess it, if you're just taking in one GUID for a record, like say you're calling a flow from a workflow and you're just passing in one GUID on a record that you're then doing other stuff with, I don't really see a lot of actual like security issues there. If you are calling an HTTP request from within the flow, then you are able to actually specify your own authentication whenever you're calling the HTTP request. So you can build out however you want to authenticate your API that you're calling to. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. All right, guys, you got 5 more minutes for more questions if you had any. It's been so great, Justin. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent preparing this, recording it, and then answering our questions. I feel like we've had a really good team here of people just on the chat, answering each other's questions and being part of the conversation. And I think that the basics are always helpful, even for experienced users, because it's always nice to like step back and see the forest for the trees and not be so focused on one area and understanding what's out there. So thank you so much for the time that you spent, and I think that's it. I don't think there's any more questions here.
Yeah, sorry, one more thing to add. One of my fellow coworkers just messaged me and pointed out that you can also put in trigger conditions for your Flow HTTP requests for additional authentication. So that can be a way to make sure that any triggers to your flow are definitely being done intentionally and authentically, as opposed to something being done by like some kind of phishing thing or stuff like that.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, Karen, I think this is a solidarity kind of job. We all keep each other honest and say, yep, that was true 2 weeks ago when we recorded, but now it's new, and we're all in this together. So thank you for collaborating with us today in this session.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yeah, let us know when you're in Houston next. Bye-bye.